They thought it would be easy. A quiet house on the edge of Willowbrook, an elderly woman living alone, and her loyal but seemingly ordinary dog. But that night, under the dim glow of a single porch light, everything they assumed was wrong. What unfolded wasn't just a robbery gone awry. It became the tale of an unyielding protector, a bond forged in love, and a fight that shook the sleepy little town to its core. Margaret Hale wasn't your typical target. Despite her silver hair and warm, inviting demeanor, she carried a quiet strength that had seen her through life's darkest storms. And then there was Duke, a rescued Malinois with a past as broken as the world they shared. Together, they had rebuilt their lives, their trust, and their unshakable bond. What they didn't know was that this night would put everything to the ultimate test. It began as Margaret returned from her routine evening walk, Duke pacing protectively at her side. The air was heavy, the neighborhood still. But as Margaret stepped inside and closed the door, shadows moved where they shouldn't have. By the time she realized she wasn't alone, it was too late. The door crashed open. Two men in masks stormed in, their voices cold and their intentions clear. Margaret stumbled back, fear tightening her chest, but Duke didn't hesitate. With a growl that seemed to rise from the depths of his soul, he stepped forward, transforming from a loving companion into an unrelenting force of nature. This wasn't just about survival, it was about loyalty. It was about love. What happened next would leave an entire town talking for weeks, spark admiration across the community, and teach everyone who heard the story that heroes can come in the most unexpected forms. As the masked intruders closed in, Margaret's heart raced, her mind scrambling for any way out. The once peaceful walls of her little home now echoed with chaos and danger. But Duke, her steadfast guardian, had other plans. His growl deepened, reverberating through the room like a warning bell, and for a moment, even the intruders hesitated. Before I take you deeper into this breathtaking moment, a story that's left even the toughest hearts in awe. Let me connect with you, my incredible audience. Where are you watching from today? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever felt the kind of bond with an animal that words can't quite describe, hit that like button. You'll soon see why this tale isn't just about loyalty, it's about miracles. Margaret's trembling hand reached for the corner of the counter as she struggled to steady herself. Her mind screamed at her to run. But where? The doorway was blocked, and the men were growing impatient. The taller one stepped forward, his voice sharp and dripping with menace. "Get the dog out of the way, or this gets ugly." But Duke didn't wait for anyone's command. With a flash of movement, he lunged at the intruder, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's arm. The air filled with the intruder's screams, his bravado crumbling into raw fear. Margaret gasped, her instincts torn between terror for Duke and awe at his bravery. The second man, quicker to react, reached for a metal pipe tucked under his jacket. "Get off him, nut!" he barked, swinging wildly. But Duke was a blur of motion, dodging the clumsy attack with the precision of a trained protector. His every move was calculated, driven not by rage, but by an unshakable need to defend the one person who had given him everything. Margaret, still frozen in place, caught sight of the phone just a few feet away on the counter. She knew this was her chance. With trembling fingers, she dialed 911, whispering her address and the words, "Two intruders, my dog, please hurry." The operator's calm voice snapped back to the fight as Duke let out another ferocious bark, driving the men further toward the door. The taller man, now clutching his injured arm, stumbled backward. "Let's go!" he shouted, desperation lacing his voice. But the second man wasn't ready to retreat. His eyes darted to the small knife on the floor, something he'd dropped in the scuffle. He dove for it, but Duke was faster. With a single leap, the dog stood over the weapon, teeth bared, a living barrier between danger and safety. Sirens pierced the tension, flashing lights spilling into the night outside. The men froze, their last shreds of confidence draining away. Duke advanced once more, his growls leaving no room for negotiation. They scrambled for the door, tripping over themselves in their haste to escape. Margaret sank against the wall, tears streaming down her face, as Duke returned to her side, his tail wagging gently, as if to say, "You're safe now." She wrapped her arms around his neck, her whispered words choked with emotion. "You saved me, Duke. You saved me." And just as the police stormed the house, guns drawn and ready, they were met not with danger but with a scene of quiet triumph. Duke stood protectively by Margaret, a hero in every sense of the word. Moments later, "So where are you watching this from? Can you feel that bond, the one that defies fear, danger, and even the odds? If you're as moved as I am by Duke's courage, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of what loyalty truly means. And don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this are just the beginning of what we'll share together. Stay with us, there's so much more to tell. As the masked intruders closed in, Margaret's heart raced, her mind scrambling for any way out. The once peaceful walls of her little home now echoed with chaos and danger. But Duke, her steadfast guardian, had other plans. His growl deepened, reverberating through the room like a warning bell. And for a moment, even the intruders hesitated. Before I take you deeper into this breathtaking moment, a story that's left even the toughest hearts in awe. Let me connect with you, my incredible audience. Where are you watching from today? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever felt the kind of bond with an animal that words can't quite describe, hit that like button. You'll soon see why this tale isn't just about loyalty. It's about miracles. Margaret's trembling hand reached for the corner of the counter as she struggled to steady herself. Her mind screamed at her to run, but where? The doorway was blocked, and the men were growing impatient. The taller one stepped forward, his voice sharp and dripping with menace. "Get the dog out of the way or this gets ugly." But Duke didn't wait for anyone's command. With a flash of movement, he lunged at the intruder, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's arm. The air filled with the intruder's screams, his bravado crumbling into raw fear. Margaret gasped, her instincts torn between terror for Duke and awe at his bravery. The second man, quicker to react, reached for a metal pipe tucked under his jacket. "Get off him, mutt!" he barked, swinging wildly. But Duke was a blur of motion, dodging the clumsy attack with the precision of a trained protector. His every move was calculated, driven not by rage, but by an unshakable need to defend the one person who had given him everything. The second man fell. Margaret, still frozen in place, caught sight of the phone just a few feet away on the counter. She knew this was her chance. With trembling fingers, she dialed 9111, whispering her address and the words, "Two intruders. My dog. Please hurry." The operator's calm voice steadied her for a moment, but Margaret's attention snapped back to the fight as Duke let out another ferocious bark, driving the men further toward the door. The taller man, now clutching his injured arm, stumbled backward. "Let's go!" he shouted, desperation lacing his voice. But the second man wasn't ready to retreat. His eyes darted to the small knife on the floor, something he'd dropped in the scuffle. He dove for it, but Duke was faster. With a single leap, the dog stood over the weapon, teeth bared, a living barrier between danger and safety. Sirens pierced the tension, flashing lights spilling into the night outside. The men froze, their last shreds of confidence draining away. Duke advanced once more, his growls leaving no room for negotiation. They scrambled for the door, tripping over themselves in their haste to escape. Margaret sank against the wall, tears streaming down her face as Duke returned to her side, his tail wagging gently as if to say, "You're safe now." She wrapped her arms around his neck, her whispered words choked with emotion. "You saved me, Duke. You saved me." And just as the police stormed the house, guns drawn and ready, they were met not with danger, but with a scene of quiet triumph. Duke stood protectively by Margaret, a hero in every sense of the word. Now, if you found yourself holding your breath during Duke's courageous fight, or felt the unbreakable bond between him and Margaret, let me know by hitting that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to hear about the power of loyalty and love. And for more tales that inspire, amaze, and remind us of the beauty in our world, together we'll weave stories that stay with you forever. See you in the next chapter. As the flashing red and blue lights faded into the distance and the police officers secured the neighborhood, Margaret finally exhaled. Her hands trembled as she stroked Duke's head, his fur damp with sweat and dust from the struggle. "You're my hero," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Duke leaned into her touch, his eyes softening as if to say, "I'd do it all again for you." The hours that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Officers moved through the house, documenting the scene and collecting evidence while neighbors gathered outside, murmuring in shock at what had transpired. Margaret sat on her old floral couch, still trying to piece together how her quiet evening had turned into a fight for survival. Duke lay at her feet, his ears perked, ready to leap into action again if needed. One of the officers, a kind-faced man named Detective Carter, knelt beside her. "Mrs. Hale, you've got yourself one incredible dog here," he said, glancing down at Duke with admiration. "He didn't just protect you, he probably saved your life tonight." Margaret managed a weak smile. "He's more than a dog, he's family," she said, her voice filled with pride and gratitude. But even as the officers assured her that the men responsible were in custody, Margaret's mind refused to rest. The warmth of the officers' words couldn't fully erase the chilling memories of the night. The echoes of crashing furniture and desperate barks lingered, tethering her thoughts to the chaos she had just survived. As the night wore on and the house emptied of police and onlookers, Margaret and Duke were finally left in peace. She tidied up as best she could, brushing aside broken glass and setting a chair upright, but the weight of the night hung heavily in the air. Exhausted, she sank into her armchair, Duke curling up on the rug beside her. The quiet of the room, though comforting, seemed fragile, like a bubble that could burst at any moment. Margaret's mind wandered back to the day she had met Duke. It was a cold winter afternoon when she had visited the local animal shelter at her daughter's insistence. She hadn't been looking for a dog, not really. But then she saw him, sitting silently at the back of his kennel, his amber eyes meeting hers. He had looked so tired, so worn, yet there was something in his gaze that tugged at her heart. That day she had given him a home. Tonight he had returned the favor. She reached down to run her fingers through Duke's fur, the memory warming her as the room's chill seemed to recede. But just as her thoughts began to drift toward sleep, the faint rustle of movement outside pulled her back into the present. Duke's ears twitched first, then his head shot up, alert. Margaret's pulse quickened as she strained to hear. It wasn't loud, just the faintest creak of the wooden porch steps. She froze, every nerve in her body on edge. Could it be them again? Peering through the window, she spotted a familiar face, her neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, leaving a basket of muffins on her porch. Her breath left her in a rush, part relief, part exhaustion. Even in the darkest times, kindness had a way of finding its way back. In the days that followed, that kindness became a constant. Neighbors stopped by with food, offers to help repair her home, and endless admiration for Duke. "You've got a legend in your home," one neighbor said, patting Duke's head as the dog sat proudly beside Margaret. What a protector. As grateful as she was for the outpouring of support, Margaret couldn't shake a lingering unease. The intruders had been caught, but the why of it all remained elusive. Why her house? Why that night? These questions lingered in the back of her mind, casting long shadows over her otherwise bright days. One quiet evening, as the neighborhood settled down, Margaret found herself sitting on the porch again, a cup of tea warming her hands. Duke sat at her feet, ever vigilant, his gaze sweeping the street, as if he too shared her unspoken concerns. The air was cool, the sky painted in fading hues of purple and gold, yet Margaret couldn't fully relax. Turning to Duke, she murmured, "Do you think they'll come back?" Her voice was soft, almost tentative, as if saying it aloud would make the possibility more real. Duke didn't move, his sharp eyes fixed on the horizon. But his steady presence was answer enough. Whatever came their way, she knew they would face it together. Margaret sipped her tea, the warmth grounding her in the present, even as her thoughts threatened to pull her into the unknown. She realized, in that moment, that fear might linger, but it didn't have to rule her life. The bond she shared with Duke, the strength he gave her, was more powerful than any shadow of doubt. As the sun dipped below the rooftops and the stars began to emerge, Margaret leaned down and scratched behind Duke's ears. "No matter what happens, we've got this," she said softly, and as Duke's tail thumped lightly against the wooden porch, it felt less like a promise and more like a certainty. The nights that followed were restless. Margaret found herself waking at the slightest creak or groan of the house, her heart racing as though danger lurked in every shadow. Duke, ever alert, would lift his head at the sound, his steady presence her only comfort in the dark. She knew the men were behind bars, yet the memory of their intrusion haunted her. Fear, she realized, wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what could happen again. One particularly cold evening, Margaret sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Duke lay beside her, his chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows as if the night itself were restless. Margaret tried to focus on the book in her lap, but her thoughts kept wandering to that terrifying night. Why her house? Why then? The unanswered questions swirled in her mind like a storm she couldn't escape. Duke stirred, his ears twitching. Margaret glanced down at him, her brow furrowing. "What is it, boy?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper against the crackling fire. Duke didn't bark, but he stood and moved to the window, his body tense. Margaret's chest tightened. She placed her mug down carefully, the slight clink of porcelain on wood sounding louder than it should. Rising slowly, she moved to the window beside Duke and peered outside. The street was empty, bathed in the pale light of the street lamps. The old oak tree in her yard swayed in the wind, its branches clawing at the sky. Nothing seemed out of place, but the unease in her chest didn't fade. She closed the curtains and tried to shake the feeling. "It's just the wind," she told Duke, her words as much for herself as for him. But as she turned back toward the warmth of the fire, a faint knock echoed through the house. Margaret froze. The sound was hesitant, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakable. Duke's growl rumbled low and steady, his body stiff as he moved toward the front door. Margaret hesitated, her pulse pounding in her ears. She wanted to believe it was a neighbor, perhaps Mr. Jenkins, with another thoughtful gesture, but the timing felt wrong. Slowly she approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. 3 rose up from a tiny room, clad in white robes and counterlings. There was no answer. Only the wind, the faint rustling of leaves, and Duke's growl growing more insistent. The Duke. Margaret's grip tightened on the door frame. "I'm not opening this door unless you tell me who you are," she said firmly. Silence stretched on the other side. Then, faintly, the sound of retreating footsteps. Margaret's heart raced as she pressed her ear against the wood, trying to hear more. Suddenly Duke barked, a sharp, piercing sound that made her jump. He lunged toward the door, his claws scraping against the hardwood as if to chase whatever was on the other side. Margaret stepped back, her mind racing. She grabbed her phone, dialing the police as she kept her eyes fixed on Duke. When the officers arrived, their flashlights slicing through the dark, they found no one. "Probably a prank," one officer suggested, his tone calm but unconcerned. "But we'll patrol the area tonight, just to be sure." Margaret nodded, though the reassurance did little to calm her nerves. As she watched the patrol car disappear down the street, she knelt beside Duke, her hand shaking as she stroked his fur. "You knew, didn't you?" she murmured. Duke's eyes met hers, filled with the kind of understanding she had come to rely on. That night, Margaret barely slept. Her thoughts churned, mixing fear with determination. Whoever, or whatever, had come to her door, she wasn't going to let them steal her peace. Not again. The next morning, she took action. She installed new locks, reinforced the windows, and even added motion-activated lights around the property. Each step felt like reclaiming a small piece of her safety, though the weight of vigilance never left her. Through it all, Duke remained by her side, his presence the only constant in the upheaval of her life. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the tension in Margaret's chest began to ease. The strange knocking didn't return, and the patrols seemed to keep the neighborhood quiet. But the unease lingered, a shadow she couldn't quite shake. It wasn't until a neighbor mentioned seeing an unfamiliar car parked down the street late at night that Margaret's fears reignited. She realized then that her fight wasn't over. Someone had targeted her, and though she didn't know why, she knew she couldn't afford to let her guard down. As she sat on the porch that evening, Duke at her side, she felt a deep resolve settle within her. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together," she said, her voice steady as she looked out at the quiet street. Duke's tail thumped softly against the wood, his silent agreement the reassurance she needed. The fire of fear had left its mark, but Margaret knew it couldn't consume her. With Duke by her side, she had already weathered the worst of the storm, and she was ready for whatever came next. Margaret's resolve carried her through the next few weeks. Her daily routines resumed, a morning walk with Duke, tending to her small garden, and greeting the occasional neighbor who stopped by to marvel at her brave protector. Yet beneath the surface of her calm exterior, the unease remained. Every creak of the house, every shadow that moved in the corner of her eye felt like a warning. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the street in hues of amber and purple, Margaret decided to take Duke on a slightly longer walk. She hoped the crisp air would clear her mind, soothe the restless energy that had taken hold since that strange knock on her door. Duke walked beside her, his steps deliberate, his eyes scanning their surroundings like a sealed, malingered sentinel. The neighborhood seemed unusually quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves underfoot. Margaret tugged her coat tighter around herself, her thoughts wandering to the peculiar events of recent weeks. She told herself it was paranoia, a lingering effect of the break-in, but Duke's occasional pauses, his ears twitching at the faintest sound, told her she wasn't alone in her unease. As they turned onto a quieter street, Margaret noticed something odd. A black sedan parked at the far corner, its engine off, but its silhouette unnervingly still. The windows were tinted, and though she couldn't see inside, she felt the weight of eyes watching her. She hesitated, her steps faltering as her pulse quickened. Duke sensed her unease immediately. His body stiffened, his ears standing alert. A low growl rumbled from his throat, not loud, but enough to let Margaret know he was ready. She tightened her grip on his leash and tried to steady her breath. "It's probably nothing," she murmured, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. The sedan's engine roared to life, its headlights flashing on. Margaret froze, her feet rooted to the ground as the car rolled forward, slow and deliberate. Duke growled louder, his body leaning forward as if daring the vehicle to come any closer. The car stopped just a few feet away. Margaret held her breath, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a man with a weathered face and sharp eyes. He glanced at Margaret, then at Duke, his expression unreadable. "Nice dog," he said, his voice rough but casual. Margaret didn't reply, her grip on Duke's leash tightening. The man seemed to sense her wariness and offered a faint smile. "Just passing through," he added before rolling up the window and driving off, his tires crunching softly against the gravel. Margaret stood still, watching the car disappear down the street, her heart pounding in her chest. "Just passing through," she muttered under her breath, doubt clouding her mind. Duke nudged her leg gently, his way of grounding her. She took a deep breath and turned back toward home, her thoughts heavy with questions. Who was that man, and why did it feel like his words carried more weight than they should? The unease lingered long after Margaret returned home. She double-checked the locks on her doors and windows, her movements mechanical, her mind replaying the encounter over and over. Duke stayed close, his watchful eyes scanning every corner of the house as if he too felt the tension. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the hours ticked by. Duke slept lightly on the rug beside her, his ears twitching at the faintest sound. Just as she began to drift off, a noise outside jolted her awake. It was faint, like the shuffle of feet on gravel, but unmistakable. Duke was up in an instant, his body rigid, his growl low and menacing. Margaret's heart raced as she grabbed her phone and crept toward the window. She peeked through the curtains, her breath catching in her throat. A shadow moved near the edge of her yard, too large to be an animal. She couldn't make out a face, but the figure lingered for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. Margaret didn't wait. She dialed the police, her voice steady despite the fear tightening her chest. "There's someone outside my house," she whispered, giving her address. The operator assured her that officers were on their way, but the minutes that followed felt like an eternity. "What do you say?" "Show it to Kelly," Blake said. Duke paced near the door, his growl unwavering, his eyes locked on the shadows outside. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for his presence, his courage a stark contrast to the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She placed a hand on his back, drawing strength from his steady resolve. When the police arrived, their flashlights cut through the darkness, but the yard was empty. No sign of the shadow, no trace of the intruder. "We'll increase patrols in the area," one officer said, his tone apologetic. "But let us know if you see anything else." As the officers left, Margaret stood on her porch, the cold night air biting at her skin. She looked down at Duke, his steady gaze meeting hers. "What are we dealing with, boy?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Duke didn't answer, but the determination in his eyes told her that, whatever it was, they would face it together. The night stretched on, heavy with unanswered questions. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger, something she wasn't prepared to face alone. But as she locked the door and sat down beside Duke, she reminded herself of one simple truth. With him by her side, she was never truly alone. The night was still, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound seem louder. Margaret sat in her armchair, Duke lying at her feet, his head resting on his paws. The flicker of the fireplace cast dancing shadows on the walls, a fragile sense of warmth in a house that no longer felt completely safe. Suddenly Duke's head shot up, his ears perked, his body stiffening like a coiled spring. Margaret noticed the change immediately. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Duke growled low and deep, his gaze fixed on the door. Then it happened. A crash from outside, followed by the shattering of glass. Margaret's heart raced as she stood, gripping the edge of the chair for balance. Duke was already on his feet, his bark echoing through the house like a war cry. The sound wasn't just noise, it was a message. "This is my home, and I will protect it." Margaret reached for her phone, but her hands shook so badly that it slipped from her grasp. She cursed under her breath, bending down to retrieve it as the sound of footsteps grew closer. "Stay calm," she told herself, though her voice was trembling. "We've been through this before." The door burst open, the force splintering the wood as two men stormed in. They weren't wearing masks this time. Their faces were hard, determined. Margaret recognized them instantly. The same men from that terrible night weeks ago. "You should have stayed quiet, lady," one of them snarled, his voice cold and threatening. Behind them. But Margaret didn't have time to react. Duke lunged forward, a blur of teeth and fur, his bark fierce enough to shake the walls. He went straight for the larger man, his powerful jaws clamping down on the intruder's arm. The man screamed, trying to shake Duke off, but the dog held firm, his growl vibrating through the room. "Get him off me!" the man shouted, panic replacing his bravado. The second man pulled a crowbar from his bag and swung it toward Duke. Margaret's voice rang out, raw with desperation. "No! Don't hurt him!" She moved without thinking, stepping between the man and her dog. The swing halted midair. The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he realized Margaret wasn't backing down. "You've got guts, old lady," he muttered, his grip tightening on the crowbar. Duke, still holding the first man at bay, glanced at Margaret, his eyes full of determination. For a moment their bond was palpable, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Margaret's heart ached as she realized just how far Duke was willing to go to protect her. The second man growled in frustration. "This isn't worth it. Let's go," he barked at his partner. But the larger man, still struggling against Duke's unrelenting grip, wasn't so quick to give in. He lashed out, knocking over a lamp in his desperation to escape. Margaret grabbed a vase from a nearby table and hurled it at him with all her strength. It shattered against his shoulder, causing him to cry out in pain. "Run, Duke!" she yelled, her voice breaking. But Duke didn't run. He released the man's arm and leapt toward the second intruder, his body a shield between Margaret and the threat. In the chaos, Margaret's phone began to ring where it had fallen earlier. The sound startled the men, and they exchanged a glance that screamed retreat. The sirens in the distance were faint, but growing louder. "This isn't over," the larger man spat, clutching his injured arm as he stumbled toward the door. His partner hesitated for a moment, his gaze lingering on Duke, who stood tall despite the blood trickling from a small cut on his side. The men fled, their shadows disappearing into the night as the sound of sirens grew closer. Margaret collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she reached for Duke. He trotted toward her, his tail wagging weakly as if to reassure her that he was okay. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. "You're my hero," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Duke licked her cheek gently, his warm, steady presence grounding her in a way nothing else could. When the police arrived, Margaret recounted the events as best she could, though her voice shook with exhaustion. Duke sat by her side, his head resting on her lap, his loyalty shining through his tired eyes. One of the officers knelt beside Duke, a look of admiration on his face. "He's a fighter," the officer said softly. "You're lucky to have him." Margaret nodded, tears welling in her eyes again. "I'm more than lucky," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "He's my family." "You've been saying that a lot lately," Margaret said carefully. "What's wrong? Are you feeling sick?" As the chaos of the night began to settle, Margaret looked at Duke, her hand resting on his head. In his eyes she saw courage, love, and an unbreakable bond that had carried them through the darkest moments, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for: peace. The days after the second attack were a blur of repairs, reassurances, and restless nights. Margaret worked tirelessly to restore her home, but the cracks in the walls seemed trivial compared to the weight in her heart. Every broken object reminded her of how fragile her sense of security had become. Yet amidst the chaos, there was Duke, her constant, her protector, her reason to keep moving forward. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight bathed the neighborhood in a golden glow, Margaret found herself sitting on the porch. Duke lay beside her, his body relaxed but his eyes ever watchful. She stroked his fur absent-mindedly, her thoughts drifting to the events that had brought them here. "Do you remember the first day we met, Duke?" she murmured, her voice soft but tinged with emotion. Duke's ears twitched, and he turned his head slightly, as if he understood every word. "Sarah, it was a cold winter's day," she continued, her eyes distant. "You sat there, in that shelter, so quiet, so still. But when you looked at me, it was like you were asking for a chance to trust, to love, to live. I didn't know it then, but you were saving me as much as I was saving you." Her voice faltered as she felt the familiar sting of tears. Duke shifted closer, resting his head on her lap, his warm, steady presence grounding her. "And now," she whispered, her fingers brushing over his fur, "you've saved me again, twice. How did I get so lucky to have you?" The wind carried the faint rustle of leaves, the world around them settling into the stillness of dusk. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the evening soothe her frayed nerves. She thought of the men who had invaded her home, their faces etched in her memory. She thought of the fear that had gripped her, the chaos that had threatened to consume her. But most of all, she thought of Duke, standing firm, unyielding, risking everything for her. He wasn't just her dog. He was her guardian, her partner, her family. As the stars began to dot the sky, Margaret felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in weeks. She reached for the small notepad she kept in her pocket, her fingers trembling slightly as she wrote, "Thank you for sending me Duke. He saved my life. Not just from danger, but from loneliness. I will always treasure him, and I will never forget what he's done for me." The note was addressed to the animal shelter where she'd found him all those years ago. Margaret smiled faintly as she folded the paper and tucked it away. It felt like a small step toward closure, a way to honor the journey that had brought them together. Duke let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping gently against the wooden porch. Margaret chuckled softly, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. "You're my hero," she said again, her voice steady this time. "But more than that, you're my heart." The night deepened, wrapping the neighborhood in a blanket of quiet. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her hand resting on Duke's head as they both gazed out at the stars. The fears and uncertainties that had plagued her for weeks seemed smaller now, eclipsed by the unbreakable bond she shared with Duke. No matter what challenges lay ahead, Margaret knew one thing with absolute certainty: they would face them together. And as she sat there, her heart full of gratitude and love, she realized that Duke hadn't just saved her life. He had given her the strength to truly live. Their story wasn't one of endings, but of new beginnings, woven together by courage, loyalty, and a love that could never be broken. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. Did this story move you? If it did, let us know by typing 2 in the comments. If there's something you think could make it even better, share your thoughts with a 7. Every bit of feedback helps us craft stories that truly resonate. And if you love stories that stir your heart and spark your imagination, hit that subscribe button to join Tapestry of Worlds. Together, we'll explore tales of courage, connection, and the extraordinary moments that make life unforgettable. See you in the next story.